Hello and welcome to our daily devotions here on the Doncaster Methodist Circuit YouTube channel. It's good to be with you again today as we gather around this passage from Matthew chapter 10 and reading verses 24 to 39. These are the words of Jesus. The student is not above the teacher, nor a servant above his master. It is enough for students to be like their teachers, and servants like their masters. If the head of the house is being called Beelzebul, how much more the members of his household? So do not be afraid of them, for there is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. What I tell you in the dark, speak in the daylight. What is whispered in your ear, proclaim from the roofs. Do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care. And even the very hairs of your head are all numbered. So don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. Whoever acknowledges me before others, I will also acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever disowns me before others, I will disown before my Father in heaven. Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be the members of his own household. Anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. I'll tell you one of the things I've noticed about the readings in recent weeks, indeed since the pandemic began really, I've noticed that the set readings for the day in the early weeks, months of the pandemic, they were all readings that helped me to preach sermons that were in many ways pastoral and comforting. But in recent weeks I've noticed that, as we've noticed, that long before there was a pandemic called coronavirus, there was a pandemic that's been going around for years called systemic racism. Ever since we noticed that, one thing I've noticed about the readings is that they've moved from being comforting and pastoral to being more challenging in their tone. I'm sure you noticed that our reading today certainly fits the bill of being very challenging. And yet these set readings, they go on a 3-year cycle. They're what's known as the lectionary, a system of readings that go on a 3-year cycle, as I say, and they were set many years ago. The lectionary knows nothing about our current circumstances. So I like to think that the readings have turned out in the way that they have through the very providence of God, who knew there would be a time when through the sermons we would comfort the disturbed. And he knew that there would be a time when through the sermons we would need to challenge and perhaps disturb the comfortable. So a few weeks ago, it was entirely right and proper that the climax of the sermon should find itself in 3 simple words. You may remember them. They were the 3 words, I am enough. That was part of a comforting and pastoral sermon. But now the readings, and are very much included in this reading today, they remind us that although it's entirely right and proper for us to say, I am enough, we need to be challenged so that, having said those 3 words, we also never allow ourselves to become complacent. And you really can't get much more of a challenge to not be complacent than to be challenged by our text for today. When Jesus says these words, he says many challenging things, but none more challenging than when he says, anyone who does not take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. The cross, one of the most painful and literally excruciating experiences a person could ever have. I say literally excruciating because excruciating comes from the Latin ex, meaning out of, cruciate, the cross. It's pain that comes out of the cross. And it turns out that this cross is what you have to embrace to be worthy of the Saviour. Be impossible, wouldn't it, to contemplate being complacent at the very same time as contemplating cross-bearing. So this passage is basically saying to us, if you want to know what shape discipleship is, then it is cruciform. It comes in the shape of a cross. No wonder that so many people choose to turn away. And yet, even though we know it comes in the shape of a cross, it's still difficult to grasp in some ways, because the cross for many of us, of course, is and remains something of an abstract concept. So we almost need it taken from the abstract into the concrete in order for us to have a handle on it, to have something to latch onto. So here are a couple of ways of getting it out of the abstract into the concrete that I've come across this week as I've been preparing for this sermon. There's a couple of definitions. I've got to read them to you now. This one definition said, to take up the cross is to identify with those who threaten the empire. In other words, taking up your cross, well, that's about standing up to the state against injustice. Second definition says this, it's also a way of identifying with those that the state regards as expendable. That's a way of talking about standing alongside those whom the state seriously disadvantages. So there's something about taking up your cross which is about standing up to be counted. There's something about taking up your cross which is about standing alongside those that are threatened and dispossessed, disenfranchised and marginalised by society and by the state. If you want to be presented with an even more concrete example, perhaps you need to hear about particular heroes of the faith who had the courage to take up their cross, especially when it meant standing up to the oppressors and standing alongside the oppressed. One such person I came across this week was somebody named Clarence Jordan, who back in the early 1940s, 1942 actually, was a graduate at the University of Georgia. He was a Master of Theology, and then he went on to have a PhD. And he also formed an interracial fellowship called Koinonia. This was 1942, the time when segregation in Georgia was at its height. And he had the courage to form this interracial fellowship. And there are a couple of things about him which not only were courageous, but they were also humorous. For example, his enemies once accused him of being a communist because he'd been seen talking to a reputed communist named Miles Horton. And his response to that, to the person who was accusing him of being a communist, was saying, do you know, I really see a failure in your logic. I can't see how talking to a communist would make me a communist. any more than talking to you would make me a jackass. Then there was a time when the Koinonia Fellowship decided to fund itself by selling peanuts on a roadside stall. Well, as they would do, the Ku Klux Klan came along with some sticks of dynamite that blew the stall up. Well, just like any saint for justice, he wasn't going to be daunted by such a thing. So they built another stall and they started selling their peanuts again, only to find that the KKK came along again, blew it up again, smithereens. So in the end, his Clarence Jordan, his Koinonia Fellowship, they stopped having a stall on the side of the road and they took to mail order for the peanuts. And they had the advertising slogan that said, "Help us ship the nuts out of Georgia." Thing is though, we read about these people of great courage. We read of these great heroes of the faith, those who had the courage to take up their cross, if that meant standing up to the oppressor and standing alongside the oppressed. And so we hear of other people, such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who obviously lost his life in the fight against Adolf Hitler. The thing is, one of the problems in using these kinds of people in sermon illustrations is that they can skim over us in some ways because they're so far removed from how we feel we are. They are exceptional people. And very often, I don't know if you're anything like me, but I can only speak for myself, I guess, but I don't feel like an exceptional person at all. And even this week, when I read about the achievements of Marcus Rashford, I find that such a humbling experience. This boy of 22 years of age has achieved so much. Perhaps a bit older than a boy now, being 22, but you know what I mean. And yet, although we often aren't going to be these exceptional people, there will be modest ways in which you and I take up our cross every day. May not sing and dance about it, but it will be there. At times when we bear the scars, perhaps you bear them still, from a time when you had the courage to stand up and be counted, stand alongside those who are excluded or marginalised. Sad to say that even within the life of our own church, sometimes there are groups of people that can feel excluded and marginalised. And sometimes, even with the life of the church, sad to say, it takes a lot of courage to actually stand in solidarity with those people. And then to bear the scars of being scorned by family even, and perhaps former friends in the so-called church fellowship itself. When you're not at church, you may be at work and perhaps you've had to bear the scars of standing up and being counted, and you've noticed some sharp practices that needed to be exposed, and you've blown the whistle. And perhaps even today you bear the scar of having the courage to take up your cross in exactly that kind of way. You know, one of the things I discovered when I was doing the background reading for today was that here we are in 1038. Sorry, chapter 10, verse 38. I know it's not the year 1038. Here we are in chapter 10, verse 38, where Jesus says that if we're going to be worthy of him, we have to take up our cross. Here's the thing though. It's the first time in Matthew's Gospel, here in the 10th chapter, that the cross has been mentioned. That's fascinating enough. But here's something that I really found mind-blowing. And it's this. that Jesus actually calls upon his disciples to take up their cross before he goes to the cross himself. And it's almost as though there's two things going on here, really. One is though, it's as though he's saying, if you really want to be a follower of me, the one who will take up his cross for you, then it's a prerequisite that in advance of that you take up the cross for yourself. But the other thing that he might be saying is that you'll never fully comprehend what I'm about to do on the cross for you, unless you've had some experience of cross-bearing for yourself. When we realise these things, I wonder if it's too fanciful to think that the fact that, as Jesus calls his disciples, their cross-bearing precedes his. I wonder if it's too fanciful to actually think and to say that this might be a way of saying that when there comes a day outside of time when we see him face to face, we will recognise him not simply because all of creation will be bowing at his feet. It is a bit of a giveaway, that you have to say. We'll recognise him because of those scars. He'll show us his hands, show us his feet, just as he did to another Thomas in another time. And we'll recognise those scars on his hands and his feet. Not so much because we knew that obviously he'd been crucified for us, but because there were times in our lives we had the courage to stand up and be counted. There were times in our lives when we had the courage to stand alongside the oppressed, and it scarred us. And the reason why his scars will be so familiar is because it's almost as though we'll load up our own and we say, "Oh Lord, snap. You show me yours, I'll show you mine." Because the thing is, Lord, you called me to follow you. And in my own modest, simple way, I sought to follow you. And in my own modest way, I discovered that if I was going to follow you on the road that you took and you take, I had to follow the same route. And so I followed you on a road. And it took me all the way to Calvary. Because not just in Black Lives Matter times, but whenever there's social injustice and oppression, there are times simply because we follow him that we cannot accommodate those who are simply doing wrong to others. There are times when we simply cannot compromise. There are times when there actually is no middle ground. And that's sometimes what's involved in standing up to be counted and standing alongside. It takes you to Calvary. And one day when you see his scars, they will be so familiar because they will look like yours.